A US B-26 bomber drops a bomb on the North Korean city of Wonsan in 1951. Interim archives, Getty Images, perhaps no country on earth is more misunderstood by Americans than North Korea. Though the country's leaders are typically portrayed as buffoonish, even silly, in fact they are deadly serious in their cruelty and skill at retaining power. Though the country is seen as Soviet-style communist, in fact it is better understood as a holdover of Japanese fascism. And there is another misconception, one that Americans might not want to hear, but that is important for understanding the Hermit Kingdom. Yes, much of its anti-Americanism is cynically manufactured as a propaganda tool, and yes, it is often based on lies. But no, it is not all lies. The US did in fact do something terrible, even evil to North Korea, and while that act does not explain, much less forgive, North Korea's many abuses since, it is not totally irrelevant either. That act was this. In the early 1950s, during the Korean War, the US dropped more bombs on North Korea than it had dropped in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. This carpet bombing, which included 32,000 tons of napalm, often deliberately targeted civilian as well as military targets, devastating the country far beyond what was necessary to fight the war. Whole cities were destroyed, with many thousands of innocent civilians killed and many more left homeless and hungry. For Americans, the journalist Blaine Harden has written, "This bombing was, perhaps the most forgotten part of a forgotten war, even though it was almost certainly a major war crime." Yet it shows that North Korea's hatred of America is not all manufactured, he wrote. It is rooted in a fact-based narrative, one that North Korea obsessively remembers and the United States blithely forgets. As might be expected, the Korean War occupies a central place in anti-American propaganda, but the propaganda dwells less on the US Air Force's extensive bombing campaign, which is hard to reconcile with the myth of the protective leader, than on village massacres and other isolated outrages. Yet even if the bombing did not cause North Korea's obsessive hatred of America and Americans, it did help to focus it. The effects of the bombing were felt nearly universally, the suffering it caused among the first shared experiences for North Koreans. Unlike the propaganda, which only recounted supposed American crimes, here was a real American crime that everyone could see for themselves, and indeed had likely affected them personally. How could it not be formative? American bombing, to be clear, did not transform North Korea from a nice country into a bad one. The seeds of the country's generations-long fascist rule had already taken root by the early 1950s, and indeed, it is worth remembering that the North had launched the war in the first place. But that bombing did end up abetting, however, unintentionally, the Kim family project of creating a paranoid, volatile, and oppressive bunker state. You can see this, for example, in Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, which was all but razed by American bombing. As Myers points out, the destruction of the original city by American bombs enabled the regime to redesign it from scratch as a grand and enduring work of propaganda in its own right. In the rare moments when we do talk about the US bombing of North Korea, it can be easy to get lost in debating its long-term political consequences. But the bombing primarily mattered at the time, and still matters today, not because it was politically counterproductive, but because it was horrific and unjust. But while today's North Korean anti-American rhetoric is so often filled with obvious distortions and lies and thus easy to dismiss, this piece of anti-American rhetoric is chillingly real. That makes the cable jarring to read even beyond the sheer awful suffering it describes. It was a moment when the official North Korean characterization of America, one that we today rightly consider propagandistic nonsense, had a lot of truth to it.